The movie starts today in a small village where an innocent little girl named Heidi lives. Her parents have passed away, and she stays with her aunt. But things take a turn when her aunt gets a job far away and can't take Heidi along. Heidi has no other relatives except her grandfather, who lives in a secluded spot at the top of the mountain and is known for his bad reputation. When Heidi and her aunt arrived at her grandfather's place, he didn't welcome them and refused to let Heidi stay, driving them away from his farm. But her aunt didn't give up and left Heidi in front of the house, forcing the grandfather to take her in. She reassured Heidi, saying she'd be safe with her grandfather, and then left. Grandfather got angry and told Heidi to follow her aunt, but she innocently replied that her aunt didn't want her. Grandpa got really mad and left Heidi all by herself, shutting the door behind him. Heidi kept calling out to him until she was exhausted and finally decided to sleep in the barn with the animals. The next morning, Grandpa came into the barn and found Heidi there, and he gave her some food. After that, he took her to the town priest and asked him to find a family to adopt her, because she couldn't stay with him. The priest looked at Heidi and saw that she was pretty and in great health. He told Grandpa that he was looking for a farming family to adopt Heidi. But in the meantime, she had to stay with her grandfather until he found the right family, assuring her that his religious duty required him to take care of his only granddaughter. Grandpa had no choice but to take Heidi back home. Once there, Heidi asked Grandpa if she could sleep in the barn again. With a smile, he told her she could sleep wherever she wanted. Heidi walked into the house and saw just a chair and a single bed, but then she spotted a small ladder leading upstairs. She climbed the ladder and found a space covered in straw. She asked her grandpa if she could sleep there, and he said yes, which made Heidi really happy. The next morning, we see a boy named Peter, who was responsible for looking after the sheep. Heidi's grandfather told him to take Heidi with him to the mountains so she could rest. Heidi went with Peter while he was watching the sheep, and she was thrilled to play with them amidst the stunning mountains and scenery. Peter took the opportunity to steal food from his bag and eat it. When Heidi came back, she noticed that her food was gone and immediately asked Peter if he had eaten it. Peter denied it and claimed that maybe the goat had eaten it instead. Later, Peter saw two goats fighting, so he quickly hit them with a stick to break it up. But Heidi stepped in and pleaded with him not to do that. Peter explained that fights between the sheep reduce milk production. Heidi suggested giving him half of her food each day if he stopped hitting the sheep. Peter asked Heidi about her life with her grandfather, then told her why the villagers hated him. He had killed someone in the past, and he advised him to be very careful. Heidi panicked, and when she got home and her grandfather gave her some food, she took it and went out to sit in the barn, feeling scared. Her grandfather noticed the fear in her eyes and asked if she had heard the rumors about him. He then said, "Don't trust what people say, but rather what you see and feel in your heart." Heidi felt the warmth of his affection, so she rushed to hug him and felt safe. Then she went up to sleep in her place. In the morning, Heidi met Peter and told him that her grandfather was going to introduce her to a family for adoption. Peter was really sad and angry because he would be alone again. When Heidi got home, she was delighted to find that her grandfather had made her a special chair just for her. He told her he wouldn't let her go and she would stay with him because he loved her. Heidi was really happy. On the second day, Heidi met Peter and told him she would stay with her grandfather and they could see each other daily at the mountaintop. But Peter told her that he was leaving the farm to go to school and would be back in the spring. Heidi then asked her grandfather if she could go to school too, but he said no because it was too far. With the arrival of winter, Heidi started to get bored, especially after Peter left. But her grandfather cheered her up by making her a sled so they could sled together on the ice. They had a wonderful time skating, and Heidi was very happy. Her grandfather took her to Peter's house. When they saw each other, they ran towards each other and hugged joyfully. From that day on, her grandfather took her every day to visit Peter at his house, carrying her on his back because she couldn't walk in the snow. The days flew by, and soon her aunt returned from the city with some surprising news. She told the grandfather that she planned to take Heidi with her to the city, where she could live with a wealthy family and go to school. But the grandfather got angry and refused, deciding to send her away. Despite this, the aunt didn't give up and stayed near the house, hoping Heidi would come back. When Heidi got home, her aunt greeted her warmly and talked about a wonderful new opportunity. She explained that a family in a big house wanted a little girl to be friends with their daughter, promising a good education and a much better living environment. But Heidi turned down the offer, insisting that she wanted to stay here and didn't want to leave her grandfather, who made her happy. Heidi's aunt lied to her, saying that her grandfather didn't want her to stay and that he had agreed for her to leave. Heidi was heartbroken and believed the lie, so she decided to follow her aunt, feeling overwhelmed with sadness. They got on the train together. Heidi stood in a corner of the last car, saying goodbye to the mountains as she left her grandfather's house, her heart heavy with sorrow. When grandfather noticed Heidi was missing, he quickly went to ask Peter if he knew anything. Peter told him that her aunt had taken her while he was away. Feeling sad, grandfather rushed to the village to find his granddaughter, but in vain. On the way, the villagers looked at him with a sarcastic expression, wondering how a little girl could have the patience to be with a guy like him. Grandfather went back to his mountain home, his heart heavy with grief over losing his granddaughter Heidi. Heidi and her aunt arrived at the mansion where they were going to live, and there they met Nanny Eli. Heidi didn't like her because of her scandalous dress and boyish haircut. After that, the nanny went outside with the aunt to talk about Heidi. She said Heidi didn't really fit in, but he would accept her staying. The aunt then asked for the agreed payment, and poor Heidi had no idea that her aunt had sold her for money. Afterward, her deceitful aunt said goodbye and lied to her, saying that if Heidi ever wanted to come back home, she would be welcomed with open arms. Heidi met Clara, the daughter of the owners. Clara's father and grandmother wanted a little girl to be Clara's friend because Clara was a lonely child. During lunch, Clara, Heidi, and the governess sat at the table. The governess explained the house rules to Heidi, showing her how to dress and eat, and that running, jumping, and making noise were forbidden. Heidi got bored with the governess's words and fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Heidi woke up and got dressed neatly. When they sat down at the breakfast table, Clara showed her how to use the cutlery and eat properly. Later on, they explored the mansion together, with Heidi pushing Clara's wheelchair. As they entered Clara's room, Heidi noticed a photo of Clara with her mother, where Clara was standing on her own legs. Heidi asked curiously, "Did you ever walk?" Clara painfully told her that after her mother passed away, she became so ill from her immense sadness that she lost the ability to walk. Clara shared how deeply she missed her mother during that sorrowful time. Then, they walked into the teacher's room where the teacher asked Heidi to read a passage. Heidi straightforwardly admitted she didn't know how to read. The teacher was taken aback and asked her about the letters, only to find out that she couldn't read those either. Heidi told her that her friend Peter had mentioned that studying was completely pointless. The teacher got really mad and went to complain to the nanny, demanding that Heidi get a new teacher. But the nanny snapped back at the teacher, accusing her of not being able to teach even a few letters to a young girl. The teacher had to start teaching Heidi from scratch to get her up to Clara's level. Heidi started to miss her grandfather and the place where she grew up because she was used to the freedom of playing and running in the mountains. She tried to open the window to catch a glimpse of the mountains and her grandfather's house, but unfortunately, all the palace windows were tightly shut. One day, Heidi asked the butler, Sebastian, who was known to be a very kind person, if he could open the window for her. Sebastian opened the window and brought her a chair to stand on. But when Heidi looked out the window, she was disappointed, seeing only the slopes of the many houses in front of her. The servant told her that she had to go to a very high place to be able to see the mountain, and showed her a distant church, telling her that if she went up to the top floor, she could see the mountain. Heidi was really happy and decided to head to the church. The next morning, Heidi and Clara headed to the church, soaking in the city's atmosphere and its charming alleys along the way. When they arrived at the church, Heidi told Clara that she would go up the stairs and enter the church alone, and Clara promised to wait. Heidi climbed to the top of the church, her heart brimming with hope. Sadly, the mountains she longed to see were nowhere in sight. She began to call her grandfather with great sadness, feeling very nostalgic for him and her home. Meanwhile, the governess walked into Heidi's room, thinking she was asleep, but was surprised when she didn't find her there. She asked the servants to search for her, but they had no luck, so Sebastian went out to look for them. At the same time, Heidi had come down from the church, feeling down because she hadn't seen her grandfather's house or the mountains. On their way home, Sebastian saw them and took them to their house. Over there, the governess was angry with Heidi and held her responsible for the disappearance. Clara tried to stick up for her, but the governess snapped that she shouldn't meddle in the children's upbringing. She decided to punish Heidi by withholding food and making her stand facing the wall. Heidi felt really sad and decided to take off her new clothes, put on her old ones, gather her belongings, and leave the house. The governess saw Heidi saying goodbye to Clara and asked where she was going. Heidi said she was going to her grandfather's, but the governess told her she wasn't going anywhere and threw her things on the floor. Heidi insisted that her aunt had said she could go home anytime, but the governess assured her that her aunt had lied and that she would never leave this mansion. Clara saw Heidi crying and felt sad because she wanted her to stay with her. When Heidi saw Clara crying, she decided to stay with her just for her. Clara was feeling sick from her sadness, thinking that everyone around her didn't love her, and because her dad was always away, and she hardly ever saw him. Heidi visited Clara in her room and told her she would stay with her. Clara was thrilled and said they would enjoy their time together. A few days later, Clara's father and grandmother came back from their trip. They were very kind and gave Heidi a warm welcome. However, the nanny complained about her, saying she wasn't suitable for Clara, couldn't read or pronounce, and was used to living in the wild with animals, so she wouldn't want to live in such a high-end place. The grandmother responded that she would make her own judgment. Grandma walked into Heidi's room just before she was about to fall asleep and started telling her an exciting story, but she stopped right in the middle of it. When Heidi asked her to continue, Grandma said that if she learned to read, she could read the story herself and know the ending. In this way, Grandma indirectly motivated Heidi to learn to read. Heidi spent the entire night trying to learn the letters and words. When she woke up, she continued practicing until she finally knew all the letters and their sounds. During the lesson, Clara read aloud what she had learned in front of the teacher, and he was really impressed by her intelligence and how quickly she picked things up. When Clara finished reading, everyone clapped and cheered her on, which made her want to keep going. Days went by, and it was time for Grandma to head back home. Before she left, she told Clara's dad that Heidi was really sad inside because she missed her grandpa and her home, and she needed to go back to him. But Clara's dad saw how happy his daughter was with Heidi around, so he chose to overlook Heidi's sadness for his daughter's sake. At night, the maid heard the manor door open on its own, which terrified her. She told the housekeeper and the butler what had happened, and they were really scared too. The next day, they told Clara's father about it, but he didn't believe them. He said ghosts weren't real and asked the doctors to stay together today to see for themselves. And at night, they heard the noise of the door opening. They began to pick up their pistols and cautiously descended towards the door. Suddenly, they found Heidi wandering, then asleep. They waited for her to go back to her room and fall asleep on the bed. Then, they woke her up and asked her about her dream. Heidi said she was dreaming about her grandfather. The doctor realized that she missed her grandfather and her home, and that she was unhappy here. He told Clara's father that Heidi was unwell and suffering from being away from her family and home. He also told her that if she didn't go back home, her condition would get worse. But Clara's dad refused and insisted that she stay because his daughter was happy with Heidi around. The doctor warned him and then left the room. Clara's dad stayed up all night, thinking about what would happen to Heidi. In the end, he decided to let her go back to her grandfather. In the morning, he tells his daughter about Heidi's poor condition and urgent need to return to her grandfather. Clara got really angry and started breaking everything in front of her. When she saw Heidi, she yelled at her and ordered her to leave without looking at her again, then ordered the maid to take her to her room. Clara's father had a conversation with Heidi and told her to get ready to leave soon. Heidi was very happy, but she hadn't forgotten Clara, so she went up to her room to say goodbye. Heidi knocked on Clara's door, but Clara didn't answer. Heidi left the manor with a deep sadness, unable to say goodbye to Clara. Heidi traveled with the butler to her mountain village, and the villagers were delighted to see Heidi in her elegant clothes. When Peter arrived, she joyfully hugged him. Then, she dashed towards the mountain, quickly removing the dress that felt uncomfortable, and felt free again as she ran and shouted her grandfather's name across the vast and beautiful lands. He couldn't believe his little girl had come back to him, so he ran to her with joy and hugged her tightly. Heidi returned to her happy life with her grandfather and Peter, just like before. One day, Heidi wrote a letter to Clara, asking her to come visit her in her village. At the palace, Clara's grandmother read Heidi's letters, and Clara had been very sick since Heidi left. Clara's grandmother decided to take her to Heidi. When they arrived, Heidi was overjoyed to see her friend Clara. They played together and were very happy. Clara's grandma sat down with Heidi's grandpa and asked him to look after Clara since she'd be staying with Heidi for a few days. Grandpa agreed and said he'd take care of her just like his own granddaughter, Heidi. Clara and Heidi sleep side by side, spend their time very happily, and play together. But Peter was really angry and jealous of Clara because she had taken away his only girlfriend, Heidi. He decided to destroy Clara's wheelchair and threw it off the hill. In the morning, they woke up and couldn't find Clara's wheelchair. They started searching everywhere, and Grandpa figured out that Peter was behind it. He decided to carry Clara on his back until they reached the spot where Peter was grazing the sheep. He said he knew it was him who took the wheelchair. He asked him to make sure the two girls were safe and then left. Clara saw the mountains Heidi always talked about for the first time, and Abel noticed she wanted to see them again. She then realized that Heidi was right and that there was no place in the world where one could live away from this place. Clara saw a butterfly land on her leg and felt it, which surprised her because she had lost all sensation in her legs. She decided to try standing up by leaning on a rock to avoid falling, and she managed to stand up on her own. At that moment, Heidi saw her walking slowly and rushed towards her with joy, followed by Peter, who came to help as well. They spent the whole day helping her practice walking on her own. Meanwhile, Clara's father arrived in the village, fuming with anger, but then he suddenly heard her laughter from afar. Turning around, he saw his daughter standing and walking, and he couldn't believe his eyes. Clara ran towards them and hugged them tightly, and they were all overjoyed to see her recovery. Clara's father expressed his heartfelt gratitude to Heidi, who had done everything she could for his daughter. After their goodbyes, Clara returned to her life to keep moving forward. Heidi had brought joy back into Clara's life after she lost her dear mother. Heidi stayed with her grandfather in the village, kept up with her studies, and was set on making her dream of becoming a famous writer come true. She wrote her first novel, sharing the story of her life, filled with emotions and experiences.